Hi, everybody. Welcome to Poetry Hour Notes from the Field. My name is Marcelo Hernandez Castillo. I'm with you again this month, in which we talk some poetry, some news in the poetry world, and some of the things that I've been thinking about. So I'm the YubaSutter Poet Laureate, and it is my job to spread poetry in our community. I'm really glad to have this series in which I can just explore some of the things that I guess I've been thinking about, some of the things that have been, I guess, possibly will make it in my next book. And just to, again, the central concern is to demystify the world of poetry, poetry in general, and create an easier access for people uh, who might not be aware of how sorry, I need my coffee, of just how rich the scene in the literary world is right now for poetry, for um, for literature in general. Some news that is recently brewing is that there was an open letter uh, to the board of the Pulitzer Prizes, um, requesting that uh, the Pulitzer Prizes be open to all writers, regardless of citizenship, which the Pulitzers currently do not allow, except for the journalism award, I believe. So, in the literature categories, like poetry, fiction, general nonfiction, and memoir, they require people to be U.S. citizens. And this open letter signed by many Pulitzer Prize finalists, Pulitzer Prize winners of recent years, and other writers from across the board are signing to petition it. So if you would like to consider signing that, that's something that's available online. Um, yeah, so going right into it, I know I'm limited on time because I'm always trying to find ways of engagement, and one of those ways is not making a hour-long recording. So I'm going to get right into it. I have already been talking about translation and in previous series, and I guess I've been working on this lecture for what is it now? Maybe 5.5 years. And it's this continuous conversation that I have, and it's a lecture that I often give about ekphrasis and translation, and I just can't seem to shake it. And I'm thinking it might be part of a larger project, and it's starting to make its way closer and closer into my book because of a sample poem that I read as part of this series a while back, in which I talk about my current project of, I guess, translating, but it's also about observation. Because as poets, as artists, what we do is we translate what we see in the world into something, into a medium, into our preferred medium, whether that is um, a sculpture, whether that is a symphony, whether that is a solo, whether that is a poem or a film, etc., etc., etc. So I have some notes that I wanted to continue thinking through, and feel free to reach out if any of this interests you for any kind of future conversation, or if you'd like to be part of the conversation as a guest in the future. I welcome. You can feel free to reach out to me through YubaSutterArts&Culture or directly on all the socials, or via my website, which my email is on there. Um, because I tend to lecture things that I don't completely understand, which might be sound counterintuitive and actually really difficult to do, because I would have hoped that what I do end up lecturing on is something that I have a pretty firm grasp on. Um, but I'm not a translation expert. I'm not an art history expert, nor am I a expert in theory, critical theory, in literary criticism, so on and so forth. But I'm curious, and I think that's at least a good starting point, is to continue to stay curious. So I'm going to be sharing some poems with you here that I wish I would have shown last time, but I guess I didn't have enough time. And just to think through some of the things that I've been wondering. One of them begins with a quote that I encountered thanks to the poet, the wonderful poet, Vanessa Angelica Villarreal, who I had the pleasure of co-teaching a summer poetry residency workshop with her. Um, and if you would like, please do check out her work. She has a new book of essays coming out called Magical Realism, and a book of poems, which I had just right now. Oh, yeah, here it is. Beast Meridian, um, which is a truly spectacular book. But the first quote that I guess got me thinking back about this idea of ekphrasis, which is writing about art. Ekphrasis specifically is, um, particularly writing a poem about a piece of artwork that the poet engages. Um, and there's many different ways to go about this, but the simplest way is just a poem that describes what is happening in a painting, or in any piece of work. So it doesn't have to be visual art. It can be music. It can be any other form. But the idea is that we are transferring from one form to another. Um, so this is the quote that I guess that I was presented with this summer, and that has been kind of brewing in my mind over and over, is objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder. Theodore Adorno. And this all comes from this idea. Again, our credit goes to Vanessa Angelica Villarreal um, for these ideas, for these thoughts um, of what happens when a object, and by object also experience, that exists in our lives, that exists with before we have the language to talk about it. What happens when that object turns into a concept? And by concept, I'm talking about language. Language is a concept, and this idea of the objects being our daily life, being the things that we experience firsthand. It's difficult to perfectly describe, let's say, a rainbow, or uh, something that we experience firsthand, and that we all experience differently. Uh, the writer Ingrid Rojas Contreras and I had a reading last week, the week before, in which she talked about emotional memory, and that there's a different kind of memory that we can attribute as emotional memory, and that is a memory that you have of how you felt during that experience, which is why some people remember something differently, even though they experienced the same event, because they have different feelings about it. They experience it differently. They they walked away with it. Maybe one walked away with it with a joyous feeling, and one walked away with it with a sour feeling. So what they remember about the event itself is going to be different. So the details is going to even filter the event as something maybe radically different. Like, two people remember a picnic, and one person remembers it very terribly because it was raining. The other one doesn't remember there ever being rain, um, because all they were focusing on was how good the sandwiches were. So even the fact that, you know, was there rain or not? yes, on one side is important, but also just as important is the validity of how each person felt. And that is what is transcended. That is what is carried through. So you might not remember the specifics of an event, but you remember how you felt, which is why I always ask my son, who is 5 and who today he started his first day of kindergarten. I dropped him off, as I know many of many kids this week, next week, maybe after what is it, Labor Day, um, begin school. Um, I asked him about what he dreamed last night, and he can't remember, as we all do, the specific details. But I always make sure to ask him, "Do you remember how you felt when you were dreaming?" And he'll say it like, "Yeah, I was sad," or "It made me feel really happy." And that is a certainty that can't be ascribed to the objects, to the details of the dream, right? The details of the dream can be a little fuzzy, but the affect is there. And this idea affect is what I latch onto in my what I latched onto in my conversation with Vanessa, of affect is what remains. Um, so this idea of Adorno, objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder, um, is, I guess, can also be said, every experience that is pushed into language leaves a remainder. And poets are trying to deal with this remainder. Um, I guess in other mediums, photography, art in general is trying to deal with this remainder that is more difficult to translate into linguistic, into visual, into a legible field that we can share with others. Um, and I'm thinking of impressionists, and beginning with, I don't know, maybe Cezanne, um, and then the rupture into modernism of the fracturing of the subconscious, the fracturing of reality, into different fields of experience, into different fields of representation. But particularly if we think about impressionism and how it begins to divert from realism to kind of make up for that which is left behind in this transference from our experience to the art that we create. At the end of the day, the art that we create has a finitude, if you want to call it that, is finite. The story has to end somewhere. The poem has to end on a line. The novel has to end on page, it has a physical limit. So what is between the lines, and again, that's an idea that came out of this uh, class that I co-taught at the Ashlyn Lores MFA program. Feel free to check them out if you're interested in studying about poetry, in working with myself, with a bunch of other really rad faculty. Is that we are working in that remainder, trying to rescue, I guess rescue is the wrong word, but trying to, and extract is also the wrong word, but trying to preserve, that's the right word, but trying to preserve what is more difficult to experience with words. Um, and this idea is, I have my banners all set this month. This leads to kind of this idea that there are moments when we have no words. There are moments when language fails, and there is pressure to have. There is pressure to have words for that. This is what every good poet tries to do, is to try to explain and express and represent the experiences that they have in the most accurate ways, in the ways that are most meaningful. Sometimes the most meaningful way of representing isn't always the most accurate way of representing. Um, so enough of me speaking. I've already spoken too much, and I've probably already talked myself into a logical corner from which I can't get out of. I gave a similar version of this lecture even just recently, and I've given this lecture again over and over and over and over again for the last 5 years. Sometimes it's a 3 hour lecture. Recently at the Lambda Literary Retreat for Emerging LGBTQIA writers, I gave it in a half hour along with slides and images and pictures, and it's too compact. So I'm trying not to steer too heavily in theory and get right to the poems, because again, this is notes from the field, notes from a poet who is actively working on trying to finish their next book, on a writer who, is in conversation with other writers, and to, again, maybe I didn't do a great job of demystifying poetry and making it more accessible. One good resource is the Poem a Day resource from the Academy of American Poets, in which you can receive one email every single day by a selected editor, selected nationally renowned editor, of poets that they have selected to be featured, and has a huge platform. I highly recommend you check that out. I'm going to add to stream this slide. So these are the poems that I'm going to be referencing and talking about. I think I might be able to start with this poem by Carl Phillips from his selected poems, which just won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry. Long overdue. I mean, Carl Phillips is just everything. Let me change this. I think this is too small. Still, even so. So I'm going to share my screen, and that might make it a little bit more visible. Okay, yeah, I think this makes it a little bit more visible. So again, this is Carl Phillips, In a Field at Sunset. Let me make sure that you can see it here, which I'm not. Oh, here it is. Okay. Add to stream. No, remove. Add to stream. There we go. All right. In a Field at Sunset. When he asked if I still loved him, I didn't answer. But of course I loved him. He'd become, by then, like the rhyme between lost and most. So, okay, cool. You can still see me and the. All right, cool. This ends up working. Thanks to technology. I like to think of this poem in this framework of ekphrasis, of a poem being written about art. And this isn't particularly speaking to a specific art piece, but in a way, the way that we experience love as an art form. And that there is a way to say, I love you and mean it, but that this at the same time has to do with this idea of the remainder, that objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder, that the tangible thing here is the act of love, is the very physical feeling that we have when we are in love. And it goes without saying, of course, I loved him. The poet, though, didn't answer because can saying I love you completely suffice? And that the love, I guess, can't completely be manifest into language. It's almost like, and when I first read this poem, I thought, and here's the thing, I thought it said he'd become by then like the lost rhyme between lost and most. Somehow I attributed the connotation, the denotation of lost, you know, that there used to be a more clear rhyme between lost and most, that they're almost exactly, they have literally, what is that? Three quarters of shared identity, three quarters, 75% of them equally match up. OST, OST. And even in proximity to each other in the alphabet, L and M, LM, they're right next to each other. They're so close that they're touching. They're so close that um, they can, that they're almost like they're holding hands. But nonetheless, connotatively, the connotations of lost and most are very opposite. That they're actually very distanced, that they're actually very far away. One almost kinds of means, an absence of, it is lost, a negative space. And the other one, and again, I can't, I always get the connotation and denotation, but the definition of the other one, most, means an abundance, it means a more than of. So even though, what is it, syntactically, no, not syntactically, morphologically, the morphemes, no, not the morphemes. Um, Even though the letters are the same, even though the rhyme is so close, lost, most, what is that? Off rhyme, slant rhyme. There's another word for it. That there's the affect, and here this is the word that I come back to. The affect is what is lost. That the affect is that missing element of, something being pushed into a concept, and the remainder is, this empty space between the rhyme between lost and most. That this person has become, has is now in that middle space of not being able to truly capture um, the idea of love. But nonetheless, we come pretty close. And I think this is what was missing from my lecture, and probably what I'm going to come back and reread, because or not reread, but come back even to this lecture. I never watched these videos myself again. I don't like to watch myself read or listen to myself, like if I'm doing a podcast or an interview. I was on the radio. The time that I've been on the radio, I don't like to hear myself. It's weird. But I think I'll look back to this so that I can get the transcript at least, because sometimes, I'm still thinking through these things. In that the thing that I think has been missing from my lecture is that even though, and Carl Phillips talks about this, I guess, failure of language a lot, or the idea that, language exists on a different plane than our experience of the world. And so from this book, the failure of language to capture a pre-language, a primal before speech essence of the thing. And so I guess I always honored that lack in translating, something from the Spanish, that there's always something missing, right? Lost in translation is what the popular phrase is. Or in recreating a poem from a painting, that there's always, that you can't capture something. And my main premise for this lecture was perhaps there is something that is better suited to be said through the vehicle of sculpture. Perhaps, there's an experience or feeling and emotion that is best, not best, but that is more meaningfully uh, represented through the vehicle of music, so on and so forth. And that comes from an essay from Walter Benjamin, um, The Task of the Translator, in which it talks about a translation existing as the afterlife of the original. But I think what was missing in my thinking throughout this is that yes, something is missing, but it nonetheless creates a new text, and that new text, is its own thing. It comes into its own being. It comes into its own um, essence. So then, what I'm trying to say then is that yes, there is something lost between the rhyme between lost and most. Uh, but nonetheless, the word most is still another word that has just as much value as the word lost. That in our translation, in our ekphrastic events in which we write a poem about a painting, that yes, something was lost, but nonetheless, we created something. We brought something into the world. And so now that exists as an original. And so that now exists as the thing to be represented. That exists now as a primary source. Yeah. So I'm going to I've already gone over, I guess, how much I wanted to talk about, but this is the painting by Gerhard Richter that Gerhard Richter is a contemporary artist, German, and the poet Robert Hass. Um, let me see if I can just view this without viewing this. Give me 1 second. I'm new to this format. Not insert image, match the fields, zoom. No, not that. No, I thought I would be able to do it to see like full screen, but I guess not. Okay, that's okay. Is it okay though? Yeah, it's okay. Is it though? Yeah, I guess it's okay. So this is the Gerhard Richter. And so how would you describe this in a poem? Where would you begin? And what is the narrative here? We think, as people, we just naturally think through metaphor. Um, and so metaphor and story, I think at the end of the day, we want to tell stories. So in a reading I just did recently, I read a really difficult poem to read, and by difficult I mean it was linguistically complex. It was less legible as like narrative prose and following along on a narrative thread. It was more experiential, so it was more. And I told the crowd, you don't have to understand this poem, you just have to experience it. And so if you took that guidance, you don't have to understand this painting and what it means and what it's saying and the underlayers of the metaphors, so on and so forth, so on and so forth, like what you would normally see on the abstract or like the description of this that you see in a museum. You just have to experience it. Right? What are the emotions that this evokes? So on and so forth. So from this poem, the wonderful poet, one of my favorite poets, Robert Hass, wrote this from this painting, wrote this poem. And this is the title poem for Robert Hass's Pulitzer Prize winning book, Time and Materials, which was published, I believe, in 2007. Um, yeah. So again, this poem is an ekphrastic poem that is written in response to as an interpretation of, as a recreation of what linguistically this painting is doing. And because this is YubaSutter Arts and Culture, it's all art forms included. So I guess this is always appropriate. Maybe my continuous lectures will be just new updates that I have on this idea and new insights or revisions of places I might have not considered. Again, if you have any ideas that like pop into you as you're listening to this, please feel free to reach out. I would love to hear them, and I would love to figure out, I would love to be done with this, but not necessarily. So this is the poem. How do I do it so that I can put them both, actually? Yeah, no. I can't. Maybe, actually. Like this? No. I thought I could put, like, add to stream. Full screen layout. Okay, cool. We'll do like that. All right, time and materials. Gerhard Richter, abstract builder. 1, to make layers as if they were a steadiness of days. So I'm just going to point out keywords and not read the poem continuously. So again, Gerhard works in layers. He finds what is beneath a particular layer. So he might start with yellow, but yellow never ends up in the final result, because that was merely an entrance point to the painting, but not necessarily where the painting remains. So there is a progression of time and materials. There's a progression of time, of materials via time, that the materials change. And so, it's a lot of thinking on his part. There's a really great documentary on Gerhard Richter of his process that I recommend you see. You check out. It's probably on Netflix or something. But if I were to recreate a poem out of this, and if I could, I guess, interpret what was the first thing that was painted on this image, and can we even see that, or is that hidden behind layers and layers and layers of paint, which equates to layers and layers and layers of meaning, which equates to, what was that first thing that brought this to life? So maybe this right here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but maybe this, or let's go like down here on the bottom right, maybe this small line right here was the first thing that made it, but has this since then gone under the process of transformation. Again, back to the poem. To make layers, as if they were a steadiness of days. It snowed. I did errands at a desk. A white flurry out the window thickening. My tongue tasted of the glue on envelopes. On this day, sunlight on red brick, bare trees, nothing stirring in the icy air. On this day, a blur of color moving at the gym, where the heat from bodies meets the watery, cold surface of glass. And I'll stop there just to, I know I said I was going to keep it at try to keep it at under 20 minutes, but it is what it is. I might continue this next month if I don't have enough time, but actually probably. I'll just finish the rest of the poem, but just briefly say that one way of adding to the narrative that we see in the image is by adding our own experiences as we are experiencing in our life. Maybe at this point in Robert Hass's life, there was this experience of a blurry day, color moving at the gym, where they have all these like bright colors. Heat from bodies meets the watery cold surface of the glass. And so we can see that projected onto the painting almost as if it's an equivalence. That this painting makes me think of the blurry, watery surface that builds on condensation from when looking through glass, that the glass distorts, that this is a painting that distorts, that image through a filtering effect. And so when we're reading two things next to each other, we're reading what the distance is between them. We're reading the relationship between the two. And so I will read the rest of the poem and then have one last brief anecdote, and we'll call it a day. And we will continue next month if you care to join us. Made love, made curry, talked on the phone to friends. The one whose brother died was crying and thinking alternately, like someone falling down and getting up, and running and falling and getting up. The object of this poem is to anaya. The object of this poem is to report a theft in progress of everything that is not these words and their disposition of on the page. The object this poem is to report a theft in progress of everything that exists that is not these words and their disposition on the page. The object of this is to report a theft in progress of ever at exist. This is no these words and their disposition on the page. To score, to scar, to smear, to streak, to smudge, to blur, to gouge, to scrape. Again, reading that into here as the action of the painting. To score, to scar, to smear, to streak, to smudge, to blur, to gouge, to scrape. Action painting, i.e., the painter gets to behave like time. The typo wound be paining to abrade. 5, or to render time and stand outside the horizontal rush of it. For a moment, to have the sensation of standing outside the greenish rush of it. 6, some vertical gesture then, the way that anger or desire can rip a life apart. Some wound of color. Some wound of color is Robert Hass's Shakespearean couplet, you might call it. The aha moment or the gathering of, even though this isn't a sonnet, it's not Shakespearean sonnet. I don't think so, actually. I hope it's not, because I've been missing that part if it is for many years that I've been reading this poem. No. Okay. Not even like, no. But his takeaway from how best to represent his version of this painting linguistically. And I was going to say more, and I have many more poems to discuss, but I guess that I'll have to save it for another time. The book that I recommend, as in poetry from the field, is the poem of Carl Phillips that we opened up with, From Then the War, and Selected Poems 2007 to 2020, published by FSG. Yeah. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I apologize for going a little bit over time, but the great thing with technology is that you can, let me stop sharing my screen. The great thing about technology is that you can listen to me 3-4 times the speed and get all of this in 10 minutes. Please check out the calendar for YubaSutter Arts and Culture. That's coming up here in the rest of the month of August. And the biggest event of the year is the Harvest Festival, the Fall Harvest Festival, which I believe is September 23rd. Please reserve your tickets for that. It's the Harvest the Arts 2023. Yes, Saturday, September 23rd, and the rest of the month of August. Lots of other programming happening. Center Stage production presenting Suzical, the YubaSutter Improv Club, the Real Book Society, Reading the Da Vinci Code, and Broken Compass in concert, as well as many, many other events. So please be sure to spread the word about all of these events, support your local arts community by donating, by sharing, and just generally being engaged. I hope you entertain. I hope you enjoyed our talk today. And again, feel free to reach out with questions, with clarifying things, and if so, I might answer them in the next installment. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your month.